In the quiet, meticulously trimmed neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates, everything had a place and everything had a rule. The mailboxes were identical, the fences stood at approved heights, and the lawns stretched like uniform green carpets under the careful watch of the Homeowners Association. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. For years, the neighborhood had run like clockwork under the stern leadership of its HOA president, a woman known for her rigid interpretation of the bylaws and her unwavering commitment to what she called community standards. Residents whispered about her meticulous inspections and her habit of measuring grass height with a ruler. Some admired her dedication, others feared her scrutiny, but no one openly challenged her authority. That was until the flowers appeared. The house on Maple Bend Drive had been empty for months before its new owner arrived. The property had once blended seamlessly into the neighborhood's neutral palette: beige siding, white shutters, a modest lawn framed by standard-issue shrubs. But when the moving trucks came, so did change. The new homeowner was a woman in her early 40s named Elena Marquez. She had recently inherited the house from her late aunt and decided to leave her city life behind in search of peace. She wasn't loud, she wasn't confrontational. She simply wanted a fresh start. And fresh was exactly what she planted. Within weeks of settling in, Elena began transforming the front yard. The plain hedges were replaced with bursts of color: marigolds blazing gold in the afternoon sun, deep purple petunias spilling over stone borders, crimson roses climbing an elegant trellis near the porch. Lavender bushes lined the walkway, their scent drifting gently into the street. A small butterfly garden took shape in the corner, alive with motion and color. It was beautiful. It was also, according to the HOA president, a problem. Willow Creek Estates had guidelines about landscaping. Subtlety was key. Approved plant lists favored modest greenery, boxwoods, azaleas, neutral-toned blooms that didn't draw too much attention. The goal was harmony, which in practice meant uniformity. Elena had read the bylaws when she moved in. She had seen the landscaping section, but she had also noticed something else: a clause about personal gardening expression, provided that plantings did not obstruct sidewalks, damage property, or pose safety hazards. Her garden met every requirement. It was tidy, well-maintained, and far from intrusive. Still, the complaint came swiftly. The first violation notice was slipped into her mailbox on a Tuesday morning. It cited non-compliant landscaping elements and demanded corrective action within 10 days. No specifics, just a warning. Elena assumed it was a mistake. She reviewed the guidelines again. She measured distances from the sidewalk. She checked height restrictions. Everything was within compliance. Calmly, she drafted a response to the HOA board, politely requesting clarification on which specific plants violated which specific rule. The reply arrived 3 days later, this time delivered by hand. The HOA president herself stood on Elena's porch that afternoon, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. She surveyed the garden as though assessing damage. What followed wasn't a conversation, but an inspection. The flowers were labeled excessively vibrant. The butterfly garden was deemed aesthetic inconsistency. The climbing roses were described as visually disruptive to neighborhood cohesion. None of these phrases appeared in the official bylaws. Elena pointed that out in her follow-up letter. She cited page numbers. She attached photos. She maintained a respectful tone, expressing her willingness to comply with any rule that actually existed. The second violation notice came the next week. This one included a fine, $50 per day for continued non-compliance. Neighbors began to notice. Some slowed their evening walks to admire the flowers. Others hurried past, wary of association. Rumors drifted through the community email chain. Words like troublemaker and attention seeker surfaced. The HOA president framed the issue as a matter of preserving property values. Elena, meanwhile, kept gardening. She paid the first fine under protest while formally requesting a hearing. She documented everything: Dates, notices, emails, even photographs of other homes with similar plants that had not received citations. Patterns began to emerge. It wasn't about the flowers. It was about control. The HOA president had long prided herself on maintaining order. Over the years, she had cultivated an image of authority that went unchallenged. But Elena's calm resistance, her refusal to quietly remove her garden without valid cause, represented something unfamiliar: accountability. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. In the weeks leading up to it, tension simmered beneath the surface of Willow Creek Estates. The HOA president increased inspections, issuing minor citations across the neighborhood, trash bins left out too long, holiday decorations removed a day late. It was as though she was reminding everyone who held the clipboard. But something unexpected happened. The flowers began to inspire others. A retired couple down the street planted a row of sunflowers along their fence. A young family added bright tulips near their mailbox. Small splashes of color appeared where there had once been only green monotony. The HOA president responded with more notices. What had started as a single violation was becoming a pattern, and patterns attracted attention. Elena prepared for the hearing with quiet determination. She organized her documents into labeled folders. She highlighted bylaw sections. She printed photographs of comparable landscaping throughout the neighborhood. She even consulted a local attorney specializing in property law just to ensure her interpretation was sound. The attorney confirmed what Elena already suspected: the HOA was overstepping. But HOAs thrived on intimidation. Most homeowners chose compliance over conflict. The system depended on it. Elena wasn't most homeowners. On the morning of the hearing, the community clubhouse filled with uneasy anticipation. Board members sat behind a long folding table. The HOA president presided at the center, posture rigid, expression unwavering. Elena took her seat calmly. What unfolded that afternoon would ripple far beyond a garden bed. Because this wasn't just about marigolds and roses. It was about power, who held it, who questioned it, and what happened when someone finally refused to back down. And as the meeting adjourned with unresolved tension hanging thick in the air, one thing became clear: the war over flowers had only just begun. The hearing did not end with resolution. It ended with silence. The heavy, calculated kind that lingers after power has been challenged but not surrendered. When the board members filed out of the clubhouse that evening, their expressions were carefully neutral. The HOA president remained seated a moment longer than the others, fingers pressed flat against the polished folding table, jaw set in a way that suggested the matter was far from over. Around the room, a few residents avoided eye contact. Others watched Elena with something new in their gaze: curiosity, perhaps even quiet admiration. Elena walked home under a sky that had shifted from gold to gray. She had presented her evidence clearly. She had cited bylaws, referenced comparable landscaping, and demonstrated that no explicit rule prohibited vibrant flowers. The attorney she consulted had prepared her well. The board had no immediate rebuttal, but they also hadn't withdrawn the fines. By morning, the next move came. A certified letter arrived at her door, stamped and formal. The HOA board had voted to uphold the violation pending further review. Meanwhile, fines would continue to accrue at $50 per day. Failure to comply within 30 days could result in a lien placed against the property. A lien for flowers. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about aesthetic preferences. It was about pressure. Elena felt the weight of it settle in her chest, but not as fear, more like clarity. She began documenting even more meticulously. Every new notice was scanned and stored. Every inspection was photographed. She installed a small security camera facing the front yard, not out of paranoia, but precaution. She had noticed something unsettling over the past week. The inspections were becoming more frequent. Sometimes the HOA president walked past twice in a single day, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every petal. Soon, other citations followed. A notice about the height of her mailbox post, though it matched every other mailbox on the street. A warning regarding the shade of her front door, described as non-neutral. a complaint that her butterfly garden might attract excessive insect activity. Neighbors began receiving similar letters. The retired couple with the sunflowers found a violation notice taped to their garage. The young family with tulips was fined for unapproved floral density. It was as though color itself had been declared rebellion, and slowly resentment bloomed alongside the flowers. Willow Creek Estates had always prided itself on order, but order built on intimidation had limits. The more notices that appeared, the more residents began comparing experiences. Group texts formed. Quiet porch conversations stretched longer into the evening. Screenshots of violation letters circulated in private messages. Patterns became undeniable. Most of the cited homes were those that had recently introduced brighter landscaping, or those who had spoken in subtle support of Elena during the hearing. The HOA president, sensing the shift, doubled down. A special community standards reminder was emailed to every resident, emphasizing the importance of uniformity in protecting property values. The message carried an undertone of warning. Non-compliance would not be tolerated. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of retreating, more color appeared. A small row of daisies near a driveway, a hanging basket of bright geraniums, a painted ceramic planter by a front step. None of it violated any written rule, but each addition felt symbolic. Elena's yard remained the centerpiece. Butterflies fluttered in the afternoon sun, drifting lazily between lavender stalks. Children walking home from school slowed to watch them. A few neighbors began quietly thanking her for standing her ground. They admired not just the garden, but the courage it represented. Still, the fines mounted. 2 weeks into the escalation, the total surpassed $700. The certified mail continued. A second letter referenced the possibility of legal action for willful non-compliance. The language was sharper now, less bureaucratic and more personal. It framed Elena's resistance as disruptive, harmful to community cohesion. Elena responded with another formal letter, this time sent through her attorney. It cited state property laws governing homeowners associations. It demanded a clear reference to any specific bylaw being violated. It requested financial transparency regarding how fines were calculated and applied. That request struck a nerve. Within days, the HOA president conducted an unscheduled inspection of Elena's property. This time she brought 2 board members with her. They walked the perimeter, measuring distances, photographing angles, whispering among themselves. But cameras recorded everything. Elena watched from inside, steady and silent, making notes of the time and duration of the inspection. Later that week, something new appeared in her mailbox. Not a violation notice, but a notice of community complaint. It claimed that multiple neighbors had expressed concern about the visual disruption caused by her garden. There were no names attached. The accusation felt vague, strategic, and then, almost as if on cue, an anonymous post surfaced on the neighborhood's online forum. It criticized selfish homeowners who think rules don't apply to them. The post gained traction quickly, drawing both support and pushback. For the first time, the conflict was public. Elena remained quiet online. Instead, she focused on preparation. She and her attorney began drafting a formal demand for mediation. They reviewed financial statements from the HOA, which by law were available upon request. What they discovered raised eyebrows. A significant portion of collected fines over the past 2 years had been allocated toward administrative expenses. The line items were vague: office supplies, consulting fees, discretionary enforcement costs. The numbers were larger than expected. Meanwhile, whispers circulated that the HOA president's landscaping company, operated by a distant relative, had been awarded multiple neighborhood maintenance contracts without competitive bidding. The picture was widening. What had started as a dispute over flowers was revealing cracks beneath the surface of Willow Creek Estates. Authority that had once seemed orderly now appeared selective. Enforcement that claimed to protect property values looked increasingly personal. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following month. This time, more residents planned to attend. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Eleanor stepped into her garden with pruning shears in hand. She trimmed carefully, maintaining impeccable neatness. If scrutiny was coming, she would meet it with perfection. Every border was clean, every pathway clear, every plant healthy. Across the street, a neighbor planted a small rosebush, bright red. Further down, the retired couple added another row of sunflowers. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The HOA president noticed. Her evening walk that day was sharper, faster. She paused longer at each colorful yard, scribbling notes. The clipboard seemed heavier now, the authority it represented less absolute. Because power thrives in silence, and Willow Creek Estates was no longer quiet. As the sun dipped behind the identical rooftops, Elena glanced down her street and saw something she hadn't expected when this began. Solidarity. Not loud, not rebellious, but growing. The war over flowers had moved beyond her front yard, and the HOA president, accustomed to unchallenged control, was about to discover that intimidation works only until someone documents it. By the time the next board meeting approached, Willow Creek Estates no longer felt like the polished, predictable neighborhood it had once been. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still aligned in perfect symmetry. But beneath that careful exterior, something had shifted. It started quietly. More residents submitted formal requests for financial transparency. The HOA bylaws allowed any homeowner to review budget allocations upon written request. For years, almost no one had exercised that right. There had been trust, or perhaps indifference. Now there was scrutiny. Elena's attorney had carefully examined the association's financial statements and noticed irregularities. Large sums categorized under administrative enforcement costs, repeated consulting payments to a landscaping company whose name appeared suspiciously familiar. The company's registered address traced back to a relative of the HOA president. When word of that connection began circulating through private conversations, skepticism hardened into concern. On the evening of the board meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was nearly full. That alone sent a message. Residents who had rarely attended before now filed into folding chairs, carrying folders of their own. Some clutched copies of violation notices. Others held highlighted printouts of financial summaries. The HOA president took her seat at the center of the table, posture rigid, expression composed but noticeably strained. She had anticipated resistance. She had not anticipated numbers. The meeting began with procedural formalities, approval of minutes, budget acknowledgements. But when the floor opened for homeowner comments, the atmosphere changed. One by one, residents stood. A retired accountant questioned the enforcement expense line items. A young father asked why landscaping contracts were not competitively bid. A middle-aged woman described receiving 3 violation notices in 2 weeks for minor issues that had never previously been cited. The pattern became undeniable when projected onto the screen. Elena had come prepared. She had organized a timeline documenting when fines increased, when colorful gardens appeared, and when enforcement frequency spiked. The correlation was stark. The surge in citations aligned precisely with her initial resistance. The HOA president attempted to frame the data as coincidence. She referenced renewed commitment to standards. She emphasized community harmony, but the numbers spoke differently. Then came the question that shifted the room. A resident asked whether any board member had a personal or financial relationship with vendors contracted by the association. Silence followed. The bylaws required disclosure of conflicts of interest. The landscaping contracts had not included such disclosure. Under mounting pressure, one board member admitted he had not been aware of the familial connection. Another looked visibly uncomfortable. For the first time in years, the HOA president did not have immediate control of the narrative. Outside, under the yellow glow of streetlights, neighbors lingered long after the meeting adjourned. Conversations overlapped, phone numbers were exchanged. A small coalition began to form, informal but focused. They called themselves the Review Committee. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. It was simply a group of homeowners determined to understand how their association operated. Over the following weeks, they requested additional records, vendor invoices, meeting transcripts, enforcement logs from prior years. Patterns emerged that were difficult to ignore. Fines had been sporadic and minimal before the current year. Enforcement had rarely escalated to liens, yet since Elena's first hearing, citations had increased nearly threefold. Meanwhile, Elena's fines continued accumulating, though she had placed payments into escrow on her attorney's advice. The threat of a lien still loomed, but it now felt less like authority and more like leverage losing its grip. The HOA president responded predictably. A community-wide email warned against spreading misinformation. It described the review committee as disruptive and accused certain homeowners of undermining property values. The tone was sharper than before, less measured. But the strategy backfired. Instead of silencing dissent, it galvanized it. Residents who had once remained neutral began questioning why transparency requests were labeled as troublemaking. A petition circulated quietly, calling for an independent audit of HOA finances. Within days, signatures climbed into double digits, then beyond. The neighborhood's uniformity, once a symbol of order, now felt fragile. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at Elena's door. This one escalated the conflict further. It declared that failure to remove non-compliant landscaping elements within 10 days would trigger formal legal proceedings to place a lien against her home. The language was unmistakably aggressive. Elena read it carefully, then forwarded it to her attorney and the review committee. That evening, something unexpected happened. Several neighbors appeared at her front yard. The retired couple brought a tray of lemonade. The young family stood nearby, their children watching butterflies drift between blossoms. Another homeowner carried printed copies of the petition, now signed by nearly half the street. They didn't chant, they didn't protest loudly. They simply stood. The symbolism was powerful. Across the street, more flowers had appeared. A bright red rosebush, yellow daisies lining a walkway, a painted ceramic planter bursting with geraniums. Color was spreading. The HOA president noticed, of course. Her evening inspection route became more deliberate, more frequent. But the dynamic had changed. Where once her presence prompted avoidance, now it was observed. Cameras recorded. Notes were taken. Control thrives in opacity. Transparency weakens it. When the petition surpassed the threshold required to call a special vote, the bylaws mandated action. An independent audit would be conducted. The board could not block it without violating procedural rules. The announcement shook the foundation of Willow Creek Estates. Whispers turned to open discussion. Longtime residents began recalling prior incidents, fines that felt arbitrary, enforcement that seemed selective. Stories that had once been shrugged off now connected into a broader pattern. Meanwhile, local interest stirred. A resident with connections to a small regional news outlet mentioned the unfolding dispute. The idea of an HOA threatening liens over flower color while facing audit scrutiny carried undeniable appeal. The HOA president attempted one final maneuver. She proposed an emergency amendment to the landscaping guidelines, seeking to explicitly restrict non-neutral floral palettes. The move was transparent, a retroactive attempt to legitimize prior enforcement, but amendments required majority homeowner approval, and sentiment had shifted. The vote failed, publicly. For the first time since her election years earlier, the HOA president experienced defeat not in whispers, but in numbers. Yet she did not resign. Instead, she grew quieter. Behind closed doors, tensions among board members intensified. Some feared legal liability, others worried about reputational damage. The audit loomed, and with it, potential consequences beyond community politics. Elena, meanwhile, continued tending her garden. Every bloom felt symbolic now, not of defiance alone, but of resilience. The butterflies still came. Children still paused to watch. The yard remained impeccably maintained, impossible to fault under written rules. The war had shifted from enforcement to exposure, and exposure has a way of spreading faster than any flower. As the audit firm began reviewing financial records and vendor contracts, rumors circulated about discrepancies larger than anyone initially suspected. Numbers that didn't align, signatures missing required disclosures, payments authorized without full board votes. The clubhouse, once a quiet administrative hub, now felt like the center of an unfolding reckoning. What began as a dispute over marigolds had evolved into a referendum on leadership. And the most unsettling part for the HOA president was not the audit itself. It was the solidarity. Because intimidation fractures when people compare notes, and Willow Creek Estates had started talking. The announcement of the independent audit moved through Willow Creek Estates like a weather front. At first, it was just tension, thick, unmoving air before a storm. Then came the shift. The audit firm arrived on a Monday morning. Two professionals in conservative suits stepped into the clubhouse carrying briefcases and secure file containers. Their presence was quiet, but unmistakable. They did not engage in neighborhood politics. They did not exchange pleasantries about landscaping standards. They requested records. All of them. Vendor contracts from the past 3 years, enforcement logs, copies of violation notices issued, records of fines collected and disbursed, board meeting minutes, conflict of interest disclosures. For the first time in years, authority within Willow Creek Estates no longer flowed from a clipboard, it flowed from documentation. The HOA president maintained her composure publicly. She described the audit in a community-wide email as a routine process, a reaffirmation of the board's commitment to transparency. But those who had attended the last meeting recognized the strain behind the phrasing. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere was different. Board members who had once deferred without question now sat stiffly during review sessions. The auditors asked precise, repetitive questions. When was this vendor selected? Was there a bidding process? Why did enforcement costs triple in the same quarter that landscaping violations increased? Were homeowners notified of changes in enforcement policy? Paper trails were examined line by line. The first irregularity was small, an invoice submitted twice under slightly altered descriptions, then another. A consulting fee authorized without a recorded vote in meeting minutes. Landscaping maintenance contracts renewed automatically without disclosure of related party involvement. Individually, each discrepancy might have been dismissed as oversight. Together they formed a pattern. Meanwhile, Elena's property remained under threat. The lien notice deadline approached, though her attorney had formally contested it pending audit findings. The association hesitated to proceed aggressively while under review, but the official posture had not softened. Elena continued her routines with deliberate normalcy. She trimmed the lavender, she watered the marigolds, she replaced a cracked stone border near the walkway. Each act of care was quiet but intentional, a refusal to let intimidation dictate her daily life. Across the neighborhood, conversations shifted from whispers to open discussion. Residents gathered in driveways comparing copies of violation letters. Several realized they had been fined for identical issues at different rates. Others noticed that some homes had never been cited at all, despite visible guideline deviations. Selective enforcement had a rhythm, and once heard, it could not be unheard. By midweek, the auditors requested electronic correspondence between board members regarding enforcement decisions. That request marked a turning point. Emails, unlike public statements, often carry less restraint. Within those exchanges were phrases that unsettled even the most patient residents. References to making an example, discussions about deterring further challenges, frustrations expressed about homeowners testing authority. None of it directly admitted wrongdoing, but the tone revealed intent. The escalation of fines following Elena's first hearing was not coincidence. It was strategy. When that information reached the review committee, reactions were measured but resolute. They understood that accusations required substantiation. The audit would determine conclusions, but confidence grew. For the HOA president, isolation began to replace control. One board member quietly consulted independent legal counsel, concerned about personal liability. Another requested that his name be removed from recent enforcement communications. The unity that had once shielded the president fractured under scrutiny. Outside the clubhouse, solidarity continued to bloom. More residents added color to their yards, cautiously, within written rules. A row of purple salvia appeared near a mailbox. Bright zinnias lined a driveway. The transformation was subtle but cumulative. Color was no longer rebellion. It was expression. The tension reached its peak on a Friday afternoon when the auditors requested a closed-door meeting with the full board. The session lasted nearly 3 hours. When the doors opened, faces told stories before words did. The preliminary findings, though not yet finalized, were serious. The audit identified undisclosed conflicts of interest regarding vendor contracts connected to the HOA president's relative. It highlighted inconsistent enforcement patterns disproportionately targeting specific homeowners. It noted procedural failures in documenting votes authorizing significant expenditures. The language was careful. Auditors do not dramatize, but the implications were clear. Transparency had revealed cracks not in flower beds but in governance. A summary report was scheduled to be distributed to all homeowners within 2 weeks. The news spread quickly. Some residents expressed vindication. Others felt uneasy. No one had anticipated that a dispute over garden colors would uncover potential ethical violations. What had begun as frustration had evolved into reckoning. The HOA president responded with one final effort to reclaim narrative control. A letter arrived in mailboxes asserting that any discrepancies were administrative errors, that no intentional misconduct had occurred, and that she remained committed to serving the community. But the authority of that message felt diminished, because now there were numbers. There were documented emails. There were contracts without disclosures. And most importantly, there were homeowners who had seen the process unfold. Elena received a separate letter that same day. The lien action against her property was temporarily suspended pending audit review. Temporarily. The word was deliberate, an attempt to avoid concession. Yet it represented retreat. For weeks, the threat of losing her home to escalating fines had hung like a shadow. Now, for the first time, that shadow thinned. Still, the outcome remained uncertain. The final audit report could recommend corrective action, policy reforms, even leadership changes, but implementation required homeowner votes. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, casting long golden light across identical rooftops now punctuated with unexpected color, the neighborhood felt transformed, not chaotic, awake. Residents who had once trusted quietly now understood the mechanics of their association. They had seen how power operated and how it could be checked. The war over flowers had forced examination of something deeper, accountability. Inside her home, Elena organized her documents once more. She no longer felt alone in the fight. The garden outside her window glowed in the fading light, butterflies settling for the evening. Across the street, a neighbor installed another planter. Further down, someone repainted their mailbox post, still compliant but no longer invisible. The HOA president remained in office, but the foundation beneath her authority had shifted. Trust, once assumed, now required proof. The final audit report would determine whether the cracks widened into collapse. And in Willow Creek Estates, everyone understood that the next chapter would not be about flowers at all. It would be about consequences. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.